And I think that Donald Trump feels like someone who is testing all of the limits, sort of like the burglar who goes down the hallway testing the doorknobs to see which ones might be locked and which ones might be open. So once again, we sort of need to look in the mirror and say, how far are we going to let this go? How far will Donald Trump push it?
Hello, listeners. Welcome to our Friday Roundtable. Joining me today are editor-at-large and columnist Russell Moore. Hi, Russell.
Hey, Clarissa.
Senior contributor Mike Cosper. Hi, Mike.
Hey, good to be here.
And political commentator Charlie Sykes. Charlie, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Since before his reelection, President Trump has intimated at a third presidential term. Though restricted to 2 terms by the Constitution, Mr. Trump appears undeterred, posting in the last few weeks a picture of Trump 2028 hats in the Oval Office via his Truth Social account. His supporters, too, seem keen on this idea. Last month, Senator Lindsey Graham said he'd like to see a third Trump term. Charlie, we see hand-wringing from one side and explaining away from the other. Is all of this about a third Trump term, as I often say to Mike on our Tuesday episodes, a mountain or a molehill?
Well, okay, so we have to break it down. I mean, he's backed off, since then. On Air Force One, he said, I can't do that because the Constitution says I can't do that. People are free to take him at his word. I would counsel somewhat, skepticism, given the fact that Donald Trump changes his mind very frequently. I mean, we could just be one emergency or one Canadian television ad away from Trump flip-flopping on all of that. And of course, we also know the degree to which he respects the Constitution's limits on presidential power. So this is one of those things that I think it stress tests our institutions and our Constitution once again. And I wrote about this earlier in the week, and I asked the question, okay, let's just sort of game this out. If he tried to get a third term, who would stop him? Would Congress stop him? Would fellow Republicans stop him? I'm reasonably confident the Supreme Court would rule against him, but are we absolutely certain that he would not make it a fait accompli like tearing down the East Wing of the White House? So, given the universe of challenges to our constitutional guardrails, this is one of them, and it's looming out there, despite Trump's apparent seeming denial that that's what he intends to do.
Charlie, in that Substack, you wrote that the 22nd Amendment bars him, but as you said, the Constitution does not enforce itself. Can you unpack that for our listeners a bit?
Well, this is something we've learned over and over again, that simply because there is a constitutional provision, someone has to do something about it. Our institutions don't just run themselves. They're made up of people. They're made up of people with values who have to exercise agency and often political courage. And one of the things that Donald Trump has done is he's run a bulldozer through many of those guardrails, many of those bulwarks that we had taken for granted. And so now we step back and go, okay, so would the courts step in and make it very, very clear that you cannot violate the Constitution? And if the courts did that, who would enforce that? And I think that Donald Trump feels like someone who is testing all of the limits, sort of like the burglar who goes down the hallway testing the doorknobs to see which ones might be locked and which ones might be open. So once again, we sort of need to look in the mirror and say, how far are we going to let this go? How far will Donald Trump push it?
Russell, one of the things that President Trump floated on Air Force One earlier this week was this idea that perhaps Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance could be running mates. He did describe this as, quote, too cute, but does this seem like an unattractive or attractive idea for somebody like President Trump who likes to be on top?
Well, I think he said he was responding to the suggestion that perhaps he could get around the Constitution by running as vice president with J.D. Vance and then having Vance resign and him becoming president, which, of course, the Constitution explicitly rules that out as well. So I think when Donald Trump said it's too cute, I'm not sure he was talking about constitutional interpretation and more talking about I'm not going to be anybody's vice president even for 5 minutes. And so I think that probably simply was a waving away of that. What I'm more concerned about, I mean, I don't think this seriously is going to happen. What worries me, though, is the response to even the floating of it. So when you see Steve Bannon, for instance, saying, we're going to announce next year how the Constitution will allow this to, how we can get around the Constitution, you have Senator Tommy Tuberville of Alabama explicitly saying, well, the Constitution rules it out, but we're going to see what President Trump decides. I mean, that language itself is really, really, I mean, if you just take that apart and think in any other time in American history, a United States senator saying, well, the Constitution says this, but we'll see what the president says, would have caused an outrage from the American people, and everybody just kind of yawns and goes back to their fantasy football. That's what concerns me about the moment we're in more than just the specific issue.
Mike, how do you respond to a comment like that?
I mean, it's, well, first of all, whenever I hear anything from Steve Bannon, the phrase that goes through my head is that he is a self-declared Stalinist who has no interest in protecting the constitutional order. Bannon's interests are, they're populist in nature, they're authoritarian in nature, and they're profoundly problematic. The man doesn't care about the Constitution. So whatever the thing he's going to roll out next year, it's going to be ridiculous. The problem, as Russell, alluded to, is that there's such a cult of personality around Trump that people will sign on and align with this. And while I've been, this has been a conversation that's been going on really since this term began. Is Trump going to try to run for a third term? I do think the Constitution is quite explicit and clear. They did not want anyone to do a repeat of what FDR did. There is a lawlessness to the Trump administration that is just stunning when you take it in. I mean, perfect example this week. The pardoning of this cryptocurrency giant, a guy named his nickname is CZ. I don't want to mispronounce his full name, but if you look at what this company did, the company's called Binance, and this was a cryptocurrency company that was laundering money for terror organizations, that was overseeing transactions for sexual exploitation, child trafficking, child pornography trafficking, all the rest. This guy is profoundly guilty, and guilty of very evil stuff. Why did he get a pardon? Because of the Trump family's interest in cryptocurrency. They have massively enriched themselves on the cryptocurrency markets since the second term began. When you see that kind of lawlessness, and then you hear, talk of a third term, I don't think we can shrug it off, because there's abundant evidence that they don't have a whole lot of interest in worrying about what the law actually is. They're worried about what can we get away with.
Charlie, Mike uses this word lawlessness. In conversations on this topic, I've also seen the word monarch show up a lot. Is this monarchical ambition, or is this lawlessness, or something else?
Well, this is, this combination of hubris and narcissism combined with a contempt for the law is always a dangerous combination, isn't it? I'm really glad that Mike brought up that pardon and the abuse of the pardon power. Bookend the pardons for his cronies and his friends with his continuing almost on a daily basis, publicly announcing his orders for the vindictive prosecution of his political enemies. I highlight this every single day because I think we've become numb to it, that the President of the United States very openly is telling the Department of Justice to go after and to investigate, indict, and jail political opponents. He just did it again within the last 48 hours. So for my friends, everything; for my enemies, the law. And I want to go back to something that Russell said, because I think this is really important, that our focus is always on Donald Trump's, lawlessness. We know who Donald Trump is. We know what motivates him. What is more extraordinary, though, is, and it's been for the last 10 years, has been watching the reaction, the response the people who ought to know better, people who once claimed that they had principles, who once claimed that they respected the Constitution, watching them surrender one principle after another, bow one knee after another. And this is why I agree with Mike that you can't just shrug this off, because we've seen them pushing and pushing and pushing, violating one norm, one law after another. The attacks on the courts, the fact that we have troops in the streets of American cities, the fact that he speaks to the military and talks about the war within, the fact that I think that he will probably invoke the Insurrection Act. So this is somebody who I think is sitting around thinking, what can I get away with? What can I do? And who's going to stop me? Because so far, no one has really stopped him. And you mentioned monarchical. We just had 7 million Americans come out for a No Kings rally. And you and I are we're talking on Thursday morning, and the picture that's on the screen of my computer right now is with the president of South Korea literally giving Donald Trump a golden crown. So I do think this whole, no one is above the law, right? That's why, the Declaration of Independence was the original No Kings document. And Donald Trump basically says, I don't care about that. I am above the law. My friends are above the law. And so what does that mean?
Russell, this seems awfully short-sighted for the Republican Party in particular. Why would a third Trump term be attractive to them? I'm thinking here the pragmatism of an ascension plan, the life of the party beyond 2028, and the fact that we have an aging president.
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump will be older in 2028 than Joe Biden was in 2024, when that was the subject of almost every conversation in the country at the time. I really think when you're dealing with members of Congress, with senators and representatives in Congress, we're not dealing with people who seriously want this for the most part, or who seriously think this is going to happen. Instead, we have the same thing we've had before, which is to say, let's flatter the president by saying that we think, oh, this might be a really great thing to do, and just kind of hope that he'll get bored with it and move on. We've seen that over and over and over again. We saw it in 2020 when it came to the stolen election claims. What's the end result of that? It's not good. And there are very few people. I mean, I think of, for those of us in the evangelical world, Kirk Cameron, of all people, from the Left Behind movies, saying this week, hey, everybody, and he's a very strong Trump supporter, hey, everybody, the use of the Insurrection Act might be really bad for us when in the future, when someone decides to use it against, say, religious people. There are very few people who are even thinking in those terms right now, and that's crazy.
Mike, on Tuesday, news outlets reported that Speaker Mike Johnson said he'd told the president that 2 terms were all he would get. He said, despite the fact that so many of the American people lament that. Do you think that's actually true? Do you think the average American on the street thinks the 2-term limit is something we could do away with if we needed to?
I think there is somewhere between 33 and 37% of the Republican Party that laments that, right? I mean, that's that hardcore base for Donald Trump that has, that really, got him into office in 2016 and has been kind of rock solid behind him and has terrified the rest of the Republican Party for a decade now. The people who love Trump, period. There has not been somebody who has risen during the Trump era who has the same level of audacity, frankly, and charisma, and has been able to sort of earn the trust of that core. And unfortunately, because of how powerful Trump has been in the public sphere, the Republican Party, I mean, what you heard from Johnson reflects this perfectly. The Republican Party is beholden to that, 33 to 37%, right? because those are the people that show up for primaries. That's why you get a Marjorie Taylor Greene. That's why you got Matt Gaetz for a little while. That's why you get people like Lauren Boebert, who in other eras, like, again, Gaetz is gone. But in other eras, these people have all said and done things that would have gotten them disciplined out of the party. There would have been a kind of hygiene that would have said, hey, we can't have these. We can't have people talking about Jewish space lasers. We can't have sexual predators. We can't have a woman in the party who's, doing sexual favors for her Tinder date in public at a performance of Beetlejuice, right? That transformation, because those folks have been so loyal to Trump, that has rendered to their benefit enormously, and at the moment there's no rolling that back. Now, again, like I happen to think that there's going to be enough sort of institutional pressure and legal pressure where Trump's not going to try this. I also think he's old, right? Like, I also think there's a certain extent to which, like, the globetrotting that he's doing, trying to sort of build this legacy for being this grand bargain peacemaker. I think that's going to take its toll. At a certain point, the guy's going to want to retire to Mar-a-Lago and play golf every day. But nonetheless, I think what Johnson said is true in the sense that when it comes to where the kind of the weight of the party is, the momentum of the party is, I think he's absolutely right.
And I just want to fact check something. Speaker Johnson did not say 2 terms are all you're going to get. That would be a perfectly appropriate Article 1 sort of thing constitutionally to do. What he said was, I told him I just don't see the way.
Right.
That's a very different sort of framing, and really points to kind of the the moment we're in right now.
Well, and it paves the way for Bannon and whatever crackpot lawyers he's able to recruit to this, rolling out their argument, much as we saw in 2020 after the election.
Charlie, what do you think of the average American? Do we have a real gap in our understanding of the value of the Constitution? Is this an education problem, a cultural education problem that's been years in the making?
Oh, absolutely. And that's really a great point. I think we'd gotten very, very complacent about many of these values. And if there's an opportunity here, it's the opportunity to relearn these values that I think we had been mouthing and become cliches. Things like, Benjamin Franklin saying, we've given you a republic if you can keep it. Well, of course, that became this, old, line that we would trot out. Or when Ronald Reagan said, we're always one generation away from losing our freedom. Well, now it's like, wait, let's talk about this. Let's talk about why it's important to have due process of law, why we just don't murder people. Let's talk about, why we would want to perhaps restrain the power of the president, why checks and balances are a good idea, why the Constitution tells the government all the things that it can't do. So I'm hoping that there will be a relearning of some of these values. But to go back to your earlier question, I agree absolutely with what Mike had to say about the Republican Party. There is no Republican Party right now that is not utterly beholden to Trump. I also agree that Trump is elderly. He's showing some signs of decline. I'm not a doctor. I'm not going there. It would be ironic if we had 2 administrations in a row where we had to cover up the aging decline of the man in the Oval Office. But the other thing that I think is the one dynamic that I can't get out of my head is at the moment Donald Trump says, no, I'm not going for a 3rd term definitively, when that's absolutely closes the door, that's the moment he becomes a lame duck. There is nothing more that Donald Trump fears than to be irrelevant and to pass the baton to somebody else, to let somebody else have that spotlight. So that's going to be part of the dynamic. You'll have people in that office like Stephen Miller saying, Mr. President, you can do this. You alone can do this. You are the only person who can bring prosperity and peace to the world. There is this emergency that requires us to set it aside. I'd also remind people, because we forget so much because the news cycle has been so crazy over the last few years. Do you remember during the Stop the Steal with the big lie about the 2020 election, he actually put out a tweet where he explicitly called for suspending parts of the Constitution to restore him to power. So this is somebody who has a track record of explicitly, word for word, saying that we should suspend the Constitution so that I can return to the Oval Office. So never forget the degree of his narcissism, his absolute desire to always be at the center of everything. And again, that's juxtaposed with the fact that he's not getting any younger. Actually, none of us are getting any younger, but he's definitely not getting any younger.
Russell, in closing, Michael Ludig writes in the New York Times this week that Trump has always told us exactly who he is. We have just not wanted to believe him. We must believe him now. Clarity comes to each of us at different times. And I'm curious, what is the way forward for the person who says, I didn't want to believe this was Donald Trump, but as I've seen these things layer up, this is making me really uncomfortable?
Well, I wish that there were more people who were having that kind of consideration. My worry right now is that we have a demoralized country where I think we've become so accustomed to one thing after the other that people have simply tuned out. There's not only too much hitting people all the time, there's a sense of powerlessness that isn't real. And when you think about the way that the Constitution actually structures this country, it isn't a real powerlessness, but it's a felt powerlessness. And of course, that's exactly the way that you end up surrendering things that people died for.
Charlie, have you seen any glimmers of hope in the midst of that numbness, or do you feel like we're really heading down a path that is pretty dark?
Well, okay, so Russell is absolutely right. One of the keys to an authoritarian regime is to convince people that resistance is futile, right? I mean, this is what they want to do. The autocrat wants to say that we are so powerful that there's no point. Hopelessness is very much part of their weapon. So I do think that we need to struggle against that demoralization, that numbness, that sense that, we had a really great run. What's your best memory of American democracy? And I have seen a few. The No Kings rally, 7 million people turn out. That's a positive sign. That's an incredible memory, but it's a down payment. It's necessary. It's not sufficient. You started to see some of the universities begin to push back, say, no, we're not going to knuckle under to Donald Trump. I thought it was very interesting. I know it may seem kind of trivial, but the whole Jimmy Kimmel story was a reminder that that big business, is not only making the smart, safe move when it caves into Donald Trump, but in fact, there are millions of people out here who are going to push back. I mean, in that particular case, they made the calculation that so many Americans have made that they were afraid of the administration. They were afraid of the FCC. So Disney and ABC caved in. What happened? The people spoke. Millions of people said, we're canceling our subscriptions. And Jimmy Kimmel is back on late night television, and he is not holding anything back whatsoever. So resistance is possible. It can be successful. People need to have that sense of agency and hope. That doesn't mean that we need to be rosy-eyed optimists and think that everything's going to fix itself, because it is not. We are in incredibly dangerous times. But we've been in incredibly dangerous times before when things looked extremely dark, and we're able to come out on the other side. So we have to have that faith. We have to have that hope. We have to realize that this is a real struggle, but it is not over yet by any means.
That's a good word. Mike, Russell, Charlie, always so good to be in conversation with you. Listen to the full episode wherever podcasts are found.